Today's topic is the Feast of Pentecost. The Feast of Pentecost. And so we kind of began talking about it last week because it is connected in a real way to the Feast of Ascension. So here's quiz number one. When is the Feast of Pentecost? Who can tell me? When is the Feast of Pentecost? 50 days after the resurrection. Wonderful. Absolutely. So, what took place on the Feast of Pentecost? The Holy Spirit came down. Very good. Now, something that few people don't know, so I'm going to share the significance of the Feast of Pentecost. The Feast of Pentecost was not originally a Christian feast. Because if you look in the scriptures, it says on the Feast of Pentecost. So there was already a Jewish feast of Pentecost. Okay? And it was 50 days after Passover. So the apostles were celebrating Pentecost. Even in the gospel it says on the Feast of Pentecost Jesus went to the temple. So we know that there was an Old Testament Feast of Pentecost. And ready for this? It was the celebration of the receiving of the Torah. The 5 books of the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, receiving of the law. Because in the Jewish tradition, the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, is also called the law. So this is an important thing for us to understand. So the giving of the law was celebrated on what we call the Feast of Pentecost, which is 50 days after Passover in the Jewish tradition. So when we hear references to the law in the New Testament, especially when Christ is referring to the law or St. Paul is talking about the law, he's not identifying simply a list of rules. The law is an all-encompassing term which references the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's why sometimes you hear the law and the prophets. So you have the law, which is the first 5 books, and then the prophecies, all of the prophets. And then also in there is the historical books. So what was being celebrated 50 days after the resurrection was the celebration of the coming of the law, the receiving of the law from God. And so there's a beautiful parallel here. We've talked about this before, how Christ came and he fulfilled the other feasts. Remember when we talked about the Feast of Passover, we talked about how Christ became the new Passover. So now the Holy Spirit becomes the new law. Where we celebrated the receiving of the law, now we celebrate the receiving of the Holy Spirit. And what did Christ promise about the Holy Spirit? Anybody? I've said this so many times in the past 2 years from the pulpit. Christ said a promise about the Holy Spirit. Anybody remember what it was? Well, he said many things, so maybe that's not a fair question.
That the Holy Spirit would be a helper.
He would be a helper. He would be a comforter. Good. I'm looking for something a little bit more enforceable, so to speak, because we're comparing it to the receiving of the law. Christ said before he went up on his cross, he said to the disciples, the Holy Spirit shall come upon you, now get this, and guide you into all truth. And so the Christian Feast of Pentecost, celebrating the receiving of the Holy Spirit and the reception of the whole truth. And so God guaranteed that the Holy Spirit would guide the apostles into the whole truth, the fullness of truth. So that's what we're celebrating on the Feast of Pentecost. Sometimes, in secular terms, people refer to Pentecost as the birthday of the church, because at Pentecost ushers in the era of the church, because we have our baptism, we have received the Holy Spirit, and shortly thereafter you have the ordination of the first 7 deacons. So sometimes in secular terms, Pentecost is referred to as the birthday of the church. But it is not the birthday of the church. It is the reception of the Holy Spirit and the protection of the Holy Spirit and the comfort of the Holy Spirit and guiding us into all truth through the holy apostles. The birthday of the church goes all the way back to Genesis. The church has always existed. We are a continuation of the Old Testament church. We are a fulfillment of the Old Testament church. So we like to call Pentecost the birthday of the church because that ushers in the new era of the church. However, it is not a fully accurate statement. So no more birthday cakes on the Feast of Pentecost. So how do we celebrate Pentecost? Anybody? There's 2 liturgical things that we do as Orthodox Christians that is the celebration of Pentecost. Who remembers what they are? And Presbytera cannot answer these questions. She's not allowed to answer the questions. Tony is upset there. She wanted to be able to hear you to have the answers. Okay, so who knows the answers? 2 liturgical things we do to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. The first is the day before. What do we do on the day before Pentecost? Anybody? Presbytera just really wants that. Should we let her answer? Yes. You better get the answer right now. Not just a memorial service. We have a Psychosabato, a Saturday of Souls memorial service. So as part of our celebration of the Feast of Pentecost, we are celebrating a memorial for all our ancestors who have come before us. And there's a beautiful prayer that includes patriarchs and all of the ancients of our church, because Pentecost ushers in that new era. And now, because we have, as we learned a few weeks ago, the resurrection, and then the ascension, the completion of Christ's ministry, and then the beginning now of the Holy Spirit's ministry, we remember our ancestors in this beautiful thing called a Saturday of Souls, Psychosabato. And so we have the memorial service for all of our ancestors. And then on the next day, on Sunday, the actual day of Pentecost, what is the special liturgical thing that we do in honor of, on the Feast of Pentecost? Who knows? No, the icons is a different feast. It's a feast. Well, we do eat. I can't hear you back there. We fast? We don't fast yet. We kneel. And boy, do we kneel. There's a special service as part of the Feast of Pentecost called the Vespers of Kneeling. Now, there's a practical reason for that, and that is because for 50 days after the resurrection, there was no kneeling in the church. For those 50 days, because we were celebrating the resurrection of Christ. Now at Pentecost, again, to make this shift into the new era, we have a service which brings the kneeling back into our daily traditions, right? And so we have the service of kneeling. And there's 3 very beautiful kneeling prayers that we offer during Vespers. Now, technically, that service is done on Sunday night. But it has become our tradition actually now for a long time, centuries, that it has become part of the Sunday liturgy. So we finish liturgy and we immediately celebrate the Vespers of Kneeling on the day of Pentecost, because it's good for us to kneel in front of God. And so we have that beautiful connection. We have the protection, the comforting, the guidance, the truth of the Holy Spirit, right, ushering in this new thing. And so for us as Orthodox Christians, it is as important as any feast, because it's what we go back to in terms of the authority of the church. In the Jewish tradition, the Feast of Pentecost went back to the authority of the Torah. What did the Torah provide for the people? The law. So now what we do is we say, well, where's the authority of the church? It rests in the Holy Spirit and in the guaranteeing and leading the apostles into all truth. And so this Feast of Pentecost for us is our guarantee of the truth. And so, like we say in the Nicene Creed, one holy Catholic and apostolic church. And what else do we say? And then we also say in the Holy Spirit, the giver of life. So these are real things for us. But the purpose that we're having our classes is so we can learn a little bit about the faith. And one of the most common things that I have encountered in my ministry, both as a youth director and now a priest, etc., is that people struggle, and it's part of our human nature, people struggle with accepting the authority of the church. Because part of our human nature, because of our ego, and I say us, includes me, I struggle with it, is that we always think we know best. And so when the church is telling us how to live, offering us this new way of life, we struggle to accept the authority of the church, thinking we know better. This Feast of Pentecost, for me at least, is where we can turn as a point of comfort, knowing that as long as we remain true to what the holy apostles said and did, we can be comforted knowing they had the full truth. So we as Orthodox, and this is not specifically about Pentecost, but it's an important thing because it's linked to Pentecost. When we say we are the Church of the Apostles, we do not teach anything as truth which cannot be found in the teachings of the Holy Apostles. So, in more contemporary words, if the Apostles said it and did it, we know that we can say and do it and be convinced of the authority because of what the Holy Spirit did at Pentecost, coming down into the Holy Apostles. Okay? Now there's another part of Pentecost, then I'll open it up for any other questions we might have, that many times people don't fully understand when you're reading in the Scriptures. If you look in the book of Acts, which is where we see the Feast of Pentecost, the Christian Pentecost, everyone who was there received the Holy Spirit. Everyone who was there at Pentecost received the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is not a gift only for a selected few. The Holy Spirit is God's gift to all. And so if you go back and when you go home tonight, open up the book of Acts and read the story of Pentecost, and you're going to see that everyone who was there received the Holy Spirit, not just the apostles. It was the apostles who Christ guaranteed would have the truth, but everyone that day received the Holy Spirit. So now what happens in our life, we are baptized and we receive the Holy Spirit. During our baptism, or if we happen to be converts during our chrismation, we receive the Holy Spirit. The church asks God to send down the Holy Spirit, and it is bestowed on us. So each one of us has the Holy Spirit. Each one of us has the Comforter. Each one of us has the Protector. And all he wants to do is lead us to Christ. That is his only objective, is to lead us to Christ. And we can be comforted knowing he's been guiding the church for just over 2,000 years. All right? Any questions about Pentecost specifically? Yes? It does, although that particular hymn we sing during Holy Week and during Great Lent, the hymn of the angels, Lord of the powers, be with us. It is a hymn to the Holy Spirit.
We have to recite that and kneel down between each phrase in front of our Anastasia.
Oh, that's in the evening prayers, yes. Very good, yeah, and it's a prayer to the Holy Spirit. 10 till. Oh, so the last question.
How about the Holy Spirit, the flames on top of the head and the,
Right.
and the speaking in tongues?
Okay, so that's a great place to end. So the Holy Spirit comes as a flame resting on top of the apostle's head, but it's a flame that does not consume. And it's a reminder of the burning bush as well. Right, because in the burning bush, Moses received the law. So now you have the flame of the Holy Spirit, and you have the apostles receiving the Holy Spirit. But it's a flame that does not burn. It does not consume. And then finally, where we will end, and it talks about the speaking in tongues. It is absolutely not some gibberish language that nobody understands. It was the gift of languages given to the church. And the evidence there very clearly is the people are saying, why is it we are hearing this in our native tongue? Because they were looking at people who shouldn't have been able to speak that language. But immediately the apostles had received the gift to speak whatever language they had to speak, to be able to bring the message of Christ to the people. So that's a great place to end. On the Feast of Pentecost, when it talks about the receiving of the gift of tongues, it is the gift of languages. It is not that something gibberish, something or other, the speaking in tongues that exists in the Pentecostal church. That is not at all what is happening at Pentecost in the book of Acts. So that's a great place to end. All right, so that takes us to the end of our session today. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to play Stump the Priest because the timekeeper says we're done, see.
Can I ask a quick question?
I reserve the right to answer it next week.
We receive the Holy Spirit during baptism. Why do some people say that after that, when they're older, that they receive the Holy Spirit?
Because they're wrong.
They're wrong.
We receive the Holy Spirit at our baptism.
Father,
Yeah.
what you receive, every time you take communion, you get the Holy Spirit.
Communion is the body and blood of Christ. Remember, Christ is not the Holy Spirit. Christ is the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the Son. We are over time, ladies. I'm sorry. I spoke too long, and so finally you all had questions, and I don't have time to answer them. So, but